So, Professor Kubo, President George W. Bush of the United States issued an ultimatum today to Saddam Hussein, and he said Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours to avert war. And what is the first impression to this speech?
Well, I felt that it means failure of the United Nations. UN couldn't decide on this matter. And second, it means failure of American diplomacy, especially a setback for Colin Powell, who was in charge of the diplomacy. It couldn't convince 9 countries in the Security Council. Third, I thought it symbolizes the serious division in the international community. A few countries will support the American effort, but many countries will oppose that. And finally, I also felt that we are really a different world after 9/11, 2001.
And the United States gave up on a new UN resolution that would have approved the use of force. And President Bush is willing to take military actions without the official support from the international community. Why President Bush is so particular about the use of force?
Yeah, I think there's a long story there. I think that the 9/11 was a turning and the most important incident. Even before the 9/11, some officials in the Bush administration were trying to overthrow the Saddam Hussein's regime, but this is only by other means than war. They are just trying to help the anti-government forces in the northern part of Iraq more directly, but not by war. 9/11 gave a lesson to the Bush people, which is that the United States is a battleground and the United States is vulnerable, and that if the United States does not strike first, Iraq or some terrorist groups with ties to Iraq might strike first, possibly with the weapons of mass destruction, thereby giving the United States much more serious damage than in the case of 9/11. So this is the strategy of prevention that the Bush people now embraces. Right after 9/11, the Bush people seriously explored the possibility of attacking Iraq as well as Afghanistan, but they gave up the idea at that time because they couldn't find any clear evidence that Iraq was involved directly in 9/11. Therefore, from the point of view of the Bush administration, this is a war for self-defense, which might be difficult for other countries to understand. It seems that the President Bush made up his mind that it is his top priority job to make sure that 9/11 never takes place again. He has now a different concept of national security, and initially, the Bush administration thought that they didn't need any authorization, even from its own Congress, and they didn't need any UN resolution. But mostly due to the persuasion by Colin Powell, the president decided to pursue a UN resolution. But we should remember that from the start, the Bush people were ready to attack Iraq alone. And again, in American perspective, Iraq has been violating the UN resolutions since 1991. Iraq has been violating 16 or 17 points in the various resolutions of UN, and Iraq has refused the inspection by UN since 1998. And even with the massive military mobilization of the United States, with the UN resolution 1441 that Iraq accept for an unconditional inspection, and with the threat of use of force, Iraq still is not complying with the UN resolution. So it is very dubious to the eyes of the Americans that Iraq will comply after 30 days or 45 days of inspection period. The Bush administration believes that if French proposal to let the inspection continue is accepted, the game of hide and seek will just go on, and there is no guarantee that Iraq will accept the unconditional inspection in the end. If Iraq is not disarmed now, Mr. Bush believes that Iraq will soon become much more serious threat. He thinks that Iraq or some terrorist groups will cause far more serious damage than in the case of 9/11 with their weapons of mass destruction, especially with nuclear weapons that it is believed that they don't have yet, but that they might have in the future.
Well, in his address, Mr. Bush said the United Nations Security Council has not lived up to its responsibilities, so we will rise to ours. And also he said they have taken every measure to avoid war. But when we look around the world, people are demanding not to use force to settle this problem. Even in the United States, anti-war demonstrations have been conducted, and it's been reported that some diplomats asked to resign from their posts. And do you believe that President Bush has gained enough support from the American people?
Yeah, at this time, the latest poll by the New York Times and the CBS News says that 55% of respondents in the United States would support an American invasion of Iraq, even if it is not in defiance of a vote of the Security Council. The poll also found that 58% of Americans said that the international organization, which means the United Nations, was doing a very poor job in managing the Iraqi crisis, a jump of 10 points from a month ago. Taken together, the Times CBS News findings suggest that the Bush has made progress, at least at home, in portraying Saddam Hussein as a threat peace while rallying support for war over rising objections elsewhere in the world. And generally speaking, Americans are very patriotic people. They tend to rally around the president in the national crisis for whatever reason, for what kind of president they have at the time. We are now seeing this traditional pattern emerging again. For all the signs of dissent and protest around the United States, it would appear that support for war is rising, at least for now.
But the American theories of peace and justice have contributed to establish the peace-building framework in the 20th century. Will this framework be destroyed if the United States actually take military actions against Iraq?
Yeah, certainly if there is a military attack without UN authorization, the authority and the prestige of Security Council will be hurt seriously. But this happened just a few years ago when the NATO started bombing in Kosovo, and the United Nations was always kind of paralyzed during the Cold War years. The prestige of UN was never high, and it's never been an effective body in the world security affairs. On the other hand, we also have to think about how effective or how not effective the UN has been in this Iraqi issue. Many of the UN resolutions have been just ignored by Iraq. The sanctions have never been effective. There's no enforcement by the UN of its own resolutions. For worse, there's been no willingness on the part of the Security Council to act and enforce the resolutions. In other words, the Council was able to issue resolutions and it was able to engage in debate kind of endlessly, but there's no enforcement. And this is the point. It was the military mobilization by the United States that brought about a little bit of enforcement on the part of Iraq. I think this aspect has not been discussed by the Japanese media or Japanese journalists. which I think is a serious flaw in our understanding of the situation.
Of course, we have to wait for another 48 hours to see the reaction of Iraq. But if the United States actually take the military actions against Iraq, what will be its justification to the international community? And do you think the international community will approve and support America's justification?
Probably the most persuasive argument would be military action in order to get rid of the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq has kept or acquired in violation of the many of U.S. resolutions. But to be frank, I don't think many countries will buy even that argument. France, Germany, or Russia will never support that kind of argument. The international community will be seriously divided on this issue. However, I also think that in the course of military action by the United States, in the event that the United States finds a lot of biological and or chemical weapons in Iraq, the U.S. case will be dramatically bolstered, buttressed, and it might witness to the fact that inspection didn't work, will never work when Iraq is not free cooperating. And this will be also a devastating blow to the French argument that inspection is enough. So in this case, we might find more support for the Bush administration, both inside and outside of the United States.
And if the United States succeeds in toppling the Hussein government, what would the United States do as a follow-up actions? And does the United States have any clear vision on the future of Iraq, and will the people of Iraq accept their plan?
Yeah, this is a very important point. There are, I think, some divisions within the Bush administration as to how to deal with post-war Iraq. So-called neoconservative people would argue that the United States will stay there for a long time to democratize Iraq and even the entire Middle East. Others would be mostly interested in ousting Saddam Hussein and just disarming Iraq. I'm not sure that the United States is ready to commit great amount of military and financial resources for long term to post-war Iraq, especially to the reconstruction of Iraq, without which American people might feel disillusioned later by looking at just confusion and the chaos there, and might wonder what this war was for after all. It will be very tough for post-war Iraq to be united, stable, democratic, free, and peaceful. On one hand, I'm sure that the people in Iraq have a strong desire, aspiration to be more democratic and free nation, and I hope they are capable of that. But on the other hand, I cannot be very optimistic about that because, Iraq is a very divided country, having a lot of minority ethnic groups. So that would be pretty tough.
And lastly, Professor, the Japanese government has already announced its support to the American and the Great Britain's firm stance against Iraq. But on the other hand, the Japanese government has been emphasizing that it is very important to have a consensus among the international community on this issue. And what should or can Japan do now?
Yeah. If you are asked which do you want, peace or war, you say, of course, peace.
Yes, yeah. Of course, peace. Yes.
But so do I. But I think that the situation is a little bit more, complicated. It's pretty obvious, first of all, that Japan cannot participate in the war itself. Japan wants a strong and working United Nations. It is not in our interest to see the UN just talk, issue resolutions, and not capable of enforcing its own resolutions. We have a potential national security threat in our neighborhood. we have to think about whether it is in our national security interest to see UN resolutions just disregarded by any of the countries in our vicinity. So in that sense, we want the UN that can enforce its own resolutions. Besides, even without the final authorizing resolutions, it is very clear that it is Iraq that should be blamed. It's clear that sanctions or inspections didn't work in this case. And this is another point. If our ally, which is the United States, is fighting for its own self-defense, we should help as much as possible within the framework of our Constitution. And finally, we should always do our best to keep our alliance in the best shape so that we can deal with any kind of threat to our own national security in the best way possible. I think that is our national security interest. I hope our Prime Minister explains these reasons clearly to the Japanese public. And I think probably in the process of the reconstruction of post-war Iraq, Japan can play a certain role in there.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for sharing your insight with us.